During a recent speech at Alt Games, a games festival taking place in Australia, the former head of PlayStation First Party dropped a little bit of a bombshell. It was here that Shuhei Yoshida revealed he had been fired from his leadership role back in 2019, which is a pretty huge difference from what he had said previously. In the past, he would usually put a nicer spin on it, saying he was just really passionate about other aspects of the company or felt his skill set didn't totally align with new directions. Essentially, it was always marketed to the public as a mutual decision, but this new statement flipped all of that on its head, and we now know officially from the man himself that Jim Ryan, who was president of SIE at the time, fired Shuhei Yoshida. That single call from Jim Ryan would go on to define this generation of PlayStation games, and its lasting effects are going to be felt for longer than Sony will ever want to admit. Shuhei Yoshida first joined Sony 40 years ago, several years before the PlayStation brand had even begun. At that time, he was part of the corporate strategy group with a focus on their PC business. However, in 1993, when Sony's PlayStation project did start up, Shuhei quickly became one of the key members working on that initiative. Shuhei's inclusion was noteworthy as he became the first non-engineer to join the team. Early on, he primarily aided in third-party relations, making calls to game studios to share what Sony was working on and try to convince them to make games for PlayStation. Eventually, Shuhei helped to create Sony's first internal product development team. In this role, he aided in bringing many of PlayStation's most iconic early-generation games to life, serving as producer on classics such as Crash Bandicoot, Ape Escape, Gran Turismo, and many more. As the newcomers in the console world, it was of course a very pivotal time for PlayStation, a time in which they needed to show gamers they meant business. And while solid hardware was important, they weren't going to convince anyone without great games to back it up. Shuhei Yoshida's work as both a third-party middleman and first-party producer was invaluable to that goal, and played a major part in PlayStation's immediate success. With that kind of positive impact on the company, it's no surprise that Shuhei quickly rose up the ranks. In April 2000, he was promoted to Vice President of Sony Computer Entertainment America. During his time in that position, SCE Worldwide Studios was formed, becoming the official banner for PlayStation's growing list of internal development studios around the world. In February 2007, Shuhei was named Senior Vice President of SIE Worldwide Studios USA, and just 1 year later was elevated to President of the entire Worldwide Studios operation. It was an incredible rise to the top, but in reality, his work was just getting started. The new head of PlayStation First Party would have a big job ahead of him. 2008 was not an especially great time for PlayStation. In fact, it was pretty much smack dab in the middle of the worst era the brand has ever endured. They were a couple years out from the PlayStation 3's disastrous overpriced launch. Third-party developers were still struggling to get any games running on it effectively due to its unconventional cell processor, and they were getting trounced by their competitor consoles. It got so bad that the entire future of PlayStation was in trouble. Internally, there was a rush to right the ship, starting with price reductions and console revisions. But more than anything, what really turned around PlayStation 3's fate was the steady flow of next-level exclusive experiences that you couldn't find anywhere else. With generation-defining titles like Uncharted, Resistance, Killzone, Little Big Planet, and The Last of Us, PlayStation put themselves back on the map as a top-tier publisher with games worth buying a console for. As we moved into the PS4 era, this newfound pedigree would only continue to grow. With heavy momentum from the second half of PlayStation 3 and Microsoft fumbling their Xbox One reveal, everything was going PlayStation's way as they prepared for their next console. And when PlayStation 4 did finally arrive in 2013, the lessons of PS3 were fresh in their minds. Led by Shuhei, we entered what many people, myself included, consider the absolute pinnacle of PlayStation First Party. Their studios were on fire with Uncharted 4, God of War 2018, Horizon, Spider-Man, and more. Additionally, thanks to great second-party deals that brought us games like Bloodborne, Detroit Become Human, or Death Stranding, it felt like we never went more than a few few months without an incredible exclusive game. Perhaps most impressively, this output only seemed to increase as the console reached its end, with Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2 coming in the system's final year. PlayStation's identity had now become fully intertwined with high-impact exclusive games. PlayStation First Party was a well-oiled machine, pumping out banger after banger, while console sales skyrocketed. From the outside looking in, there appeared to be no reason to change how anything was going, which is why what came next was all the more surprising. On November 7th, 2019, Sony and Shuhei Yoshida made the shocking announcement that he would be stepping down as head of PlayStation First Party. He would be replaced by Hermen Hulst, who was previously managing director at Guerrilla, helping to oversee production of Killzone and Horizon. Shu would not be leaving PlayStation altogether though. Instead, he would take on a new role, leading the PlayStation Indies initiative. In this position, Shuhei would focus on fostering indie development partnerships, an important task for sure, but certainly a step below leading all of PlayStation Studios. At the time of this press release, it was portrayed as a decision Shu had made himself. The term stepping down very explicitly implies that, and there was constant talk about how passionate Shu was about indies, or how he might actually enjoy that process more than modern-day AAA game development. And to be fair, there was some very real benefit to investing in indies like this. PlayStation has had a rocky history with indies, especially during the PS3 era, with Xbox pushing the wildly successful Xbox Live Arcade initiative around that same time. PlayStation quickly fell behind. They began to patch up those relationships during the PS4 generation, and now Shuhei's new role would be the next step. Having someone with the credibility and background of Shuhei working with these independent teams was an incredible opportunity, and seeing PlayStation make such a heavy investment into what had become a very important part of the gaming market was great to see. It was definitely disappointing that Shu would no longer be leading PlayStation First Party since he had done such great work in that role, but considering what he would be doing next, and the way it was initially framed, it was easier to accept. For the immediate few years following this announcement, it was essentially business as usual, or at least it appeared that way. PlayStation First Party seemed pretty unaffected. We got the great end to PS4 in 2020, and then received Spider-Man Miles Morales, Returnal, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Horizon Forbidden West, and God of War Ragnarok on PS5 within the first 2 years. With output like that, it was pretty easy to forget the Shuhei situation. Hermen Hulst sat back and got all the praise for these great games, living it up in his first few years as head of PlayStation Studios. But in the time since then, it's become clear it was all a facade. Video games take a long time to make, especially nowadays, and so with that in mind, all of these games I just mentioned were still Shuhei Yoshida's games, and it wouldn't be until a few years later that we would actually see Hermen's vision come to fruition. And well, that has gone worse than I think even his biggest detractors could have predicted. The PlayStation 5 generation has been an extremely fruitful one for Sony. The console has sold exceptionally well, keeping pace with its predecessor despite being significantly more expensive and never receiving a price reduction. But through all the success, it has still often seemed like something was missing. The generation felt hollow at times, or like it never truly got rolling, and I think the primary reason for this feeling is their own first-party output. Early on, we gave Hermen Hulst the benefit of the doubt. With games taking so much longer to make now than they used to, it really wasn't fair to compare his output to Shuhei's. Shu's era is inherently going to look a lot better because games came out so much faster, allowing the list of release titles to grow at a rapid pace that will likely never be matched again. But as the years have gone on, it's become apparent that Sony's slowing first-party release schedule is not just a sign of the times. It is a direct result of bad decisions by their management. As I'm sure most of you know, the Jim Ryan and Hermen Hulst regime placed a major emphasis on trying to land a live service multiplayer hit. And that, in theory, quality was not necessarily terrible. When you see what the most played games in the world are, it's perfectly reasonable for a publisher to say, hey, we would really like to have one of those. The mistake they made was using first-party teams to try and find that multiplayer hit, causing them to stray far away from their expertise and wasting precious time they could have spent on traditional single-player games. Just look at a few of their teams. Bluepoint had a launch game and then nothing else for the entire rest of the generation before their shutdown. Naughty Dog will very likely only release one new game before PS6 rolls around. Other teams like Bend may miss the era entirely. All of those studios were sidetracked by the live service endeavor, slowing down a release process that was already going to be slower than it ever was before. So while it's absolutely true that game development timelines have grown for reasons outside of Herman and Jim Ryan's control, it is also true that their decisions exacerbated the problem. On that topic, there was an important dynamic to the Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst partnership that we need to discuss. Jim Ryan is not a gamer. He clearly has no real interest in games or even knows that much about them, but that's okay. He's a businessman who understood what he was doing in that regard and led PlayStation hardware to a lot of success. However, when you have a leader like that, it's important to get the right people around him who can pick up the slack in areas he lacks. That is who Herman Hulst was to Jim Ryan. He was the guy who was supposed to understand games, know what the market would respond well to, and have an eye for what generally works. And it's become abundantly clear he does not have the stuff necessary for that task. I mean, hey, he did great stuff with Guerrilla. Overseeing that team as they transitioned from Killzone, a linear FPS, to Horizon, a fully open world action RPG, was genuinely impressive. But it's been a decade since then, and Herman has exhausted whatever rope came from that success. He has shown an inability to determine what is marketable or what is worthy of investment. Every successful game PlayStation has had this generation was either greenlit by Shuhei Yoshida or is a sequel to a game greenlit by Shuhei Yoshida. As for Herman's big investments into Bungie, Concord, or Fair Games, they were all met with immediate public rejection. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Herman's job is easy. I would argue it's one of those innate skills you kind of just have or you don't. And unfortunately, Herman has shown on multiple occasions that he simply doesn't have the knack for it. Allow me to give you a quick example of exactly what I mean. Back in February 2025, Shuhei Yoshida sent out a tweet about an indie game that was still fairly obscure at that time, making a bold proclamation that it would be a 2025 Game of the Year contender. That game was Blueprints, which would go on to become one of the highest rated games of the year and did indeed make many Game of the Year nomination lists. In other words, Shuhei looked at an indie game no one had ever heard of before, from a random developer that had never made a game, and correctly identified it would be a top release in an absolutely stacked year. Meanwhile, Herman Hulst saw Concord and thought, this is our Star Wars. Buy the studio, get the merchandise ready, and sign us up for an Amazon Prime Video collaboration immediately. It then sold less than 50,000 copies and was shut down within 2 weeks. That is the difference between these two men, and that is the difference PlayStation got when replacing Shuhei with Herman. So if Shuhei was so great at what he did, and those who came after him were not, it raises the question of why he was ever replaced to begin with. As I mentioned previously, we thought for a long time it was a decision he made himself, but the statements at Alt Games have changed all of that. He explicitly says he was fired, and goes on to clarify the reason was because, and I quote, Jim Ryan wanted to remove me from first party because I didn't listen to him. He asked me to do some ridiculous things, and I said no. It's unclear what exactly Shu is referring to when he says ridiculous things are asked of him, but when we look at the timeline of events, we can make some pretty strong assumptions. Shuhei has said publicly he would have resisted the live service push had he still been in a leadership role. He also said in an interview with Kinda Funny that he wasn't interested in adapting PlayStation IPs into film or TV shows because he felt at the time the industry looked down on games and was not respectful to them. Considering live service games and multimedia projects have been PlayStation's biggest initiatives since Shuhei's departure, it's not not especially difficult to guess what things he didn't want to partake in. It would seem to me that this was Jim Ryan's vision, and when Shuhei wasn't immediately on board, he was removed. And that's an incredibly short-sighted, arrogant decision. As we fast forward to PlayStation today, a whole lot has changed. Jim Ryan retired from his role as CEO in 2024. Shuhei Yoshida is no longer leading PlayStation Indies, as he also left the company in 2025. Jim Ryan was initially replaced with a two-CEO system, which had Hideaki Nishino overseeing the platform side of the business, while our good friend Herman Hulst would be elevated to CEO of the studio business group. However, Herman was quietly demoted back down to his prior role as head of first party in April of last year. With Nishino now the sole CEO and leader of SIE, we're starting to see his ideologies take place, such as reports stating PlayStation is moving away from releasing their first-party games on PC. I am interested to see where Nishino takes things from here and how he feels about the current state of the brand, but the unfortunate reality is we won't find out those answers for years. That's what's so devastating about the mistakes made by Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst. They don't just go away because someone new steps in. Almost every studio they have is now behind schedule, multiple years have been wasted, billions of dollars have been burned, and entire teams are gone. Nothing can undo those decisions made, and it's an era that will haunt PlayStation for quite literally the next decade. It is not an exaggeration to say that Jim Ryan choosing to fire Shuhei Yoshida cost PlayStation an entire generation of games, and that impact will continue to be felt even as we move into the next one. As you can likely tell, I'm extremely frustrated by this entire situation. To fire someone who has had a massive positive impact on this brand since its very inception is downright unthinkable. Hearing that it came from Jim Ryan, who was not supposed to be the one calling the shots on their game output in the first place, is even more absurd. Shuhei deserved better than to be let go that way, and the PlayStation brand has only gotten worse as a result. Because so much else has gone their way, this hasn't really impacted their financials just yet, but they got extremely lucky in that regard. With the future of the console line looming close, this mistake isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It is going to linger. And as a PlayStation fan, I just hope they can get back on track before it's too late.